The blood from the trout ran down Emmett Stanton's forearms in thin rivulets, mixing with the salt crystals embedded in every crack and crevice of his calloused hands. He barely felt the sting anymore as he sliced through another silvery belly, his knife moving with the precision of a man who had performed this task 10,000 times before. The autumn sun beat down on his broad shoulders as he worked beside the creek that ran through the valley below his cabin, his long, dark hair tied back with a strip of leather to keep it from his face. Mountains rose around him like sentinels, their peaks already dusted with the first snow of the season, and he knew what that meant. Winter was coming early to the Montana Territory in this year of 1883, and he had work to do. His hands had already begun to crack from the salt and the cold creek water. The skin around his knuckles split open in thin lines that wept and stung. But Emmett did not stop. He could not stop. Someone was depending on him, though she did not know it yet. 3 weeks ago, he had found her collapsed beside the trading post in Guthrie, Oklahoma, after he had made the long journey south to sell his furs. She had been so thin he could count her ribs through her worn calico dress, her blonde hair matted and tangled, her lips cracked from dehydration. The proprietor had told him she was a widow woman whose husband had died of fever the previous spring, leaving her with nothing but debt. She had been trying to work off what was owed by cleaning and cooking at the trading post, but there was barely enough to feed one mouth, let alone two. Emmett had done something he had never done before. He had offered to pay her husband's debt in full in exchange for her agreeing to travel north with him to his cabin before the mountain passes became impassable. He needed help, he had told her, someone to keep house while he trapped through the winter. It was not entirely a lie, though it was not entirely the truth either. What he needed was someone to share the long, dark months with, someone to keep the loneliness at bay. And she, Lily Everson, had looked at him with those startling green eyes and agreed with a quiet dignity that made his chest ache. They had traveled for 2 weeks to reach his valley, and during that time he had learned her story in bits and pieces. She was 22 years old, originally from Pennsylvania, where her father had been a schoolteacher. She had married young, at 18, to a man named Thomas who had promised her a new life in the West. Instead, he had dragged her from town to town, chasing rumors of gold and silver, never settling, never planning for the future. When the fever took him, she had nothing. Not even enough money to send word back to her family, who had disowned her for marrying against their wishes. Emmett was 28, and he had been alone in these mountains for 6 years. He had come west after the war, after he had seen enough death and destruction to last several lifetimes. The wilderness had healed something in him, the silence and the struggle of survival replacing the chaos of battle. He had built his cabin with his own hands, learning to trap and hunt and fish, learning to read the weather and the seasons. He had thought he was content with solitude, but the moment he had lifted Lily from that dusty ground in Guthrie, cradling her slight weight against his chest, something had shifted inside him. Something he had thought long dead had stirred back to life. Now she was up at the cabin, probably sweeping or mending or doing one of the 100 small tasks she seemed to find to fill her days. She worked constantly, as though afraid he would send her away if she did not prove her worth. He had tried to tell her to rest, that she needed to regain her strength, but she would only nod and agree, and then continue working the moment his back was turned. So he had decided to do the only thing he could think of. He would make sure she had enough to eat through the winter. He would fish until his hands bled if necessary, preserving every trout and pike and bass he could pull from the creek, salting them and smoking them until she had stores enough to last until spring. The pile of cleaned fish beside him had grown to nearly 40, their silver scales glinting in the afternoon light. His hands were a mess of cuts and salt burns, the skin so dry it had turned white in places, cracking along the creases of his palms. He plunged them into the creek to rinse away the blood and brine, hissing at the cold shock of the water. When he pulled them out, fresh blood welled from the deepest cracks, and he wrapped them in a spare cloth before reaching for another fish. "Emmett!" Her voice carried down from the cabin, high and clear, and he turned to see her standing on the porch, one hand shading her eyes as she looked down toward the creek. Even from this distance he could see that she had filled out some in the past 3 weeks. Her dress no longer hung quite so loosely on her frame, and there was color in her cheeks. The sight made something warm unfurl in his chest. He raised one wrapped hand in acknowledgement and watched as she started down the path toward him. She moved carefully, her skirts gathered in one hand, stepping over roots and rocks with the caution of someone still learning the terrain. When she reached him, she stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the pile of fish and then his wrapped hands. "What have you done?" she asked, her voice sharp with concern. Before he could answer, she had reached out and taken his wrist, gently unwrapping the cloth to reveal the cracked, bleeding skin beneath. Her sharp intake of breath made him want to pull away to hide the damage, but her grip was surprisingly firm. "It is nothing," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He did not talk much these days, and when he did, the words felt clumsy and inadequate. "The salt and cold, they dry the skin." "This is not nothing," she said, and there was something fierce in her voice that surprised him. "This is infection waiting to happen. Why would you do this to yourself?" He looked at her, at the way the sun caught the gold in her hair, at the concern etched across her features, and found he could not lie to her. "Winter is coming. You need food. I wanted to make sure you had enough." Something shifted in her expression, softening and hardening all at once. "Not at the cost of your hands," she said. "What good is food if you work yourself to ruin providing it? Come back to the cabin. I will clean these wounds properly and make a salve for the cracking." "There are still fish to clean," he protested, but she was already gathering up the clean trout, her movements quick and efficient. "Then I will help you finish. But first we tend to your hands. No arguments." He wanted to argue anyway, wanted to tell her that he was fine, that he had endured far worse than a few cracked hands, but the look in her eyes stopped him. It was the first time since they had arrived at the cabin that she had asserted herself, the first time she had spoken to him as an equal rather than as an employee addressing her employer. It made him realize how carefully she had been moving around him, how much she had been holding back. So he nodded and followed her up the path to the cabin, carrying the gutting knife and the salt barrel while she managed the fish. The cabin was small but sturdy, built from logs he had hewn and notched himself. It had 2 rooms, the main living area with the fireplace and his sleeping space, and a smaller room he had hastily added when he knew Lily would be coming, giving her a space of her own. The walls were chinked tight against the wind, and the roof was solid. He had spent the first winter he was here learning what happened when you did not prepare properly, and he had nearly frozen to death. He would not make that mistake again. Inside, Lily directed him to sit at the rough-hewn table while she filled a pot with water and hung it over the fire to warm. She moved around the cabin with growing confidence, no longer the uncertain, half-starved woman he had brought here. She found the tin of lard and the dried herbs he kept for emergencies, mixing them together in a small bowl while the water heated. When it was warm enough, she poured it into a basin and brought it to the table, kneeling beside him and taking his hands in hers. The touch of her fingers on his skin sent an unexpected jolt through him. She worked carefully, cleaning away the dried blood and salt, her brow furrowed in concentration. He watched her face, memorizing the curve of her cheek, the way she bit her lower lip when she was focused. He had never been this close to her before, had never allowed himself the luxury of truly looking at her. Now, he could not seem to look away. "How long have you been doing this?" she asked, not looking up from her work. 3 days, he admitted. "Since the big run of fish started. They will stop soon when the water gets too cold. I wanted to catch as many as possible." 3 days, she repeated, and there was something almost sad in her voice. "You have been down at that creek for 3 days, destroying your hands, all to make sure I have enough to eat this winter." "Yes," he said simply, because there seemed no point in denying it. She looked up at him then, her green eyes searching his face. "Why?" The question hung between them, heavy with unspoken things. He could have given her a dozen practical answers, because it was his responsibility as the person who had brought her here, because he had made a commitment when he paid her debts, because it was what any decent man would do. But sitting there with his ruined hands in hers, her face so close he could count the faint freckles across her nose, he found he could not lie. "Because the thought of you going hungry again makes me feel like I cannot breathe," he said, the words coming out rough and unpolished. "Because I have lived alone for 6 years, and in 3 weeks you have made this cabin feel more like a home than it ever has. Because when I found you in Guthrie, something in me recognized something in you, and I knew I could not leave you there." Her hands stilled on his, and for a long moment she simply stared at him. He watched emotions flicker across her face too quickly to name, and he braced himself for rejection. He had no right to feel what he felt for her. He had brought her here under the guise of employment, had promised her safety and shelter, not romantic entanglement. She had every reason to be angry with him for this confession, but then her eyes filled with tears and she said, "I've been so afraid." "Of me?" The thought was like a knife to his chest. "No," she said quickly, "never of you. Afraid of this, of what I have been feeling. I lost Thomas barely 6 months ago, and I know I should still be mourning. But the truth is, Emmett, I mourned that marriage long before he died. He was not cruel, but he was careless, thoughtless. He made promises he never kept and plans he never followed through on. I learned not to depend on him, not to expect anything. And then you appeared, this stranger who paid my debts and asked nothing in return except that I travel north with you, who built me my own room without being asked, who has never once looked at me with anything but respect and kindness, and who now has worked himself to injury making sure I will not go hungry." She paused, lifting one of his hands to her cheek, pressing it there despite the rough, cracked skin. "I am afraid because I have never felt about anyone the way I am beginning to feel about you, and I do not know if I have the right to feel it." His other hand came up almost of its own accord, cupping her face, his thumb brushing away the tears that had begun to fall. "You have every right," he said. "You have the right to feel whatever you feel, Lily, and if what you feel has any resemblance to what I feel, then perhaps we can figure this out together." She turned her face into his palm, her lips brushing against the cloth she had wrapped around his hand, and the tenderness of the gesture nearly undid him. He had been in battle, had faced death more times than he could count, but nothing had ever made him feel as vulnerable as this small woman kneeling beside him, holding his broken hands like they were something precious. "Let me finish tending these," she said finally, pulling back enough to apply the salve she had made. It smelled of lard and sage and something else he could not identify, and it soothed the burning sting immediately. She wrapped his hands in clean cloth, her movements gentle and sure, and when she was done, she stood and looked down at him. "Qui pas? No more fishing until these heal," she said firmly. "We have 40 fish already cleaned. That is more than enough for now. And when you do go back to it, I will help you. We will work together, and we will both monitor each other to make sure neither of us works to the point of injury. Agreed?" He stood, towering over her by nearly a foot, his broad shoulders blocking the light from the window behind him. "Agreed," he said, "but only if you agree to something as well." "What is that?" "That you stop treating yourself like a hired servant in this cabin. You are not here to earn your keep, Lily. You are here because I want you here, because I need you here in ways that have nothing to do with clean floors or mended shirts. Can you do that?" She studied him for a long moment, and he saw the exact instant she let go of whatever fear had been holding her back. Her shoulders straightened, her chin lifted, and when she smiled at him, it was with a warmth that made his heart stagger in his chest. "I can do that," she said, "if you can accept that I am going to fuss over you and scold you when you do foolish things like destroying your hands for my sake." "I can accept that," he said, and then, because he could not help himself, he bent down and kissed her forehead, a chaste press of lips that nevertheless felt like a promise. She leaned into him for just a moment, her hand resting against his chest, and he wrapped his arms around her carefully, mindful of his bandaged hands. She fit against him perfectly, her head tucked beneath his chin, and he thought that if he could stay in this moment forever, he would die a happy man. But there was work to be done. Winter was coming, and they had a life to build together. So after a moment, he released her and stepped back, and they returned to the task at hand. Together, they finished cleaning and salting the remaining fish, working side by side at the table. She proved to be quick and efficient with a knife, her cuts clean and sure, and he found himself telling her about the valley, about the animals he trapped, and the way the seasons changed in the mountains. She told him more about her childhood in Pennsylvania, about her father's love of books and learning, about the brother she had not seen in 5 years. She had a quick laugh and a sharp wit that surprised him, and he realized that she had been hiding these parts of herself, afraid perhaps that he would not appreciate them. As the afternoon wore into evening and they worked together in the golden light filtering through the cabin windows, he felt something settle in his chest, something that felt like contentment, like coming home after a long and weary journey. When the last fish was cleaned and salted and laid out on the smoking racks he had built behind the cabin, they washed their hands at the pump and returned inside. Lily made dinner from the supplies he had brought back from Guthrie, a simple stew of dried beans and salted pork with the last of the fresh bread she had baked that morning. They ate at the table, and for the first time since she had arrived, the conversation flowed easily between them, no longer stilted or careful. After dinner, they sat by the fire, and he showed her how to mend the leather straps on his traps, his bandaged hands clumsy but determined. She scolded him gently and took over the task, her nimble fingers making quick work of the repairs while he sat back and watched, his heart full in a way it had not been in years. When it was time for bed, she stood and looked at him for a long moment, something uncertain flickering across her face. "Emmett," she said quietly, "thank you. For everything. For Guthrie, for bringing me here, for those fish, for seeing me." "Always," he said, and the word was a vow. She nodded and retreated to her room, closing the door behind her, and he banked the fire and settled into his own bed, his wrapped hands resting on his chest. Sleep came slowly, his mind replaying every moment of the day, every word exchanged, every touch. He had not planned on this, had not expected to find love in these mountains, but as he drifted off, he thought that perhaps the best things in life were the ones you did not plan for, the ones that simply appeared when you needed them most. The next morning dawned cold and clear, frost glittering on the ground outside the cabin. Emmett woke early as always, but when he emerged from his room, he found Lily already up, the fire blazing and coffee brewing on the stove. She looked up when she heard him and smiled, and the sight of it chased away the last lingering shadows of sleep. "How are your hands?" she asked, coming over to unwrap the bandages and examine his palms. The salve had worked wonders overnight, the angry redness faded to a dull pink, the deepest cracks beginning to close. "Much better," he said truthfully. "That salve of yours is miraculous." "My mother's recipe," she said. "She was always tending to my father's paper cuts and ink stains. I never thought I would use it for something like this." She rewrapped his hands with fresh cloth and then poured them both coffee, the bitter, steaming liquid chasing away the morning chill. They ate breakfast together, and then Emmett announced that he needed to check his trap lines, something he had been neglecting during his fishing marathon. Lily immediately declared that she would come with him, and though he protested that it would be a long, cold walk through rough terrain, she was adamant. "You said I should stop acting like a servant," she reminded him. "Well, a partner would accompany you on important tasks, would they not? I want to see what you do, how you live out here, and besides, I could use the fresh air and exercise." He could not argue with that logic, so he bundled her into one of his spare coats, which hung absurdly large on her frame, and found her a pair of boots he had traded for last year that were closer to her size. She looked like a child playing dress-up in adult clothes, but her eyes were bright with excitement, and he found himself grinning at her enthusiasm. They set out into the crisp morning, their breath pluming in the cold air. The trap line ran along the ridge above the cabin, through stands of pine and aspen, and Emmett led the way, pointing out animal tracks in the frost and explaining which ones he was after and which ones he left alone. Lily listened intently, asking questions that showed she was genuinely interested, not simply being polite. At the first trap, they found a fat beaver, and Lily watched as he dispatched it quickly and humanely, resetting the trap with practiced efficiency. She did not flinch or look away, and he appreciated that. Life in the wilderness was not easy or gentle, and he was glad she seemed to understand that. As they continued along the line, checking trap after trap, he told her about his first winter in the mountains, how unprepared he had been, how close he had come to dying. He told her about the blizzard that had trapped him in the cabin for 2 weeks, how he had run out of food and had to subsist on boiled leather and melted snow. He told her about the grizzly that had destroyed his first cache of furs, teaching him the hard way about proper food storage. In turn, she told him about her journey west with Thomas, about the hardships of traveling in a wagon with everything you owned, about the dust and the heat and the endless monotony of the trail. She told him about the towns they had passed through, some thriving and some barely clinging to existence. She told him about the morning she had woken to find Thomas burning with fever, about the 3 days she had nursed him before he slipped away, leaving her alone in a strange town with nothing but his debts. By the time they returned to the cabin, the sun was high overhead and they were both hungry and tired. But there was a new ease between them, a sense of partnership that had not existed before. They had shared their stories, their scars, and in doing so had begun to build something real and lasting. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm together. Emmett's hands healed slowly but surely, and when he returned to fishing, Lily was there beside him, learning to gut and clean with the same efficiency he had. They worked together to build up their winter stores, smoking and salting fish, drying berries and wild herbs, storing root vegetables in the cold cellar beneath the cabin. They checked the trap lines together, and Lily proved to have a keen eye for tracking and an intuitive understanding of animal behavior. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, and Emmett would read aloud from the handful of books he owned, his deep voice bringing the words to life. Lily would sew or knit, her hands always busy, creating new shirts for him from fabric she had brought from Guthrie, or thick socks for the winter ahead. Sometimes they would simply talk, sharing thoughts and dreams and fears in the intimate darkness of the cabin. And slowly, cautiously, they grew closer in other ways, a touch on the shoulder that lingered, sitting close enough that their legs brushed, Emmett taking her hand as they walked the trap lines, Lily leaning against him as they watched the sunset from the cabin porch. Each touch was deliberate, considered, a step forward in the dance they were learning together. One evening in late October, as the first real snow began to fall outside, Emmett worked up the courage to pull her onto his lap as they sat by the fire. She came willingly, settling against his chest with a soft sigh of contentment, her head resting on his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, marveling at how right this felt, how perfectly she fit against him. "I love you," he said quietly, the words simple and true. She turned her face up to his, her green eyes luminous in the firelight. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have from the moment you picked me up in Guthrie, though I was too frightened and confused to recognize it then." He kissed her then, a real kiss, his lips meeting hers with a tenderness that made his chest ache. She responded immediately, her hands coming up to tangle in his hair, pulling him closer. The kiss deepened, becoming something more urgent, more desperate, months of longing and restraint dissolving in the heat between them. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Emmett rested his forehead against hers. "I want you to be my wife," he said, "not because of some debt or obligation, but because I cannot imagine spending my life with anyone else. Will you marry me, Lily?" "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." They held each other through the night, wrapped in blankets by the fire, talking about the future they would build together. They would stay in the mountains, in this valley Emmett loved. In the spring, they would travel to the nearest town with a preacher and make their union legal and binding. They would expand the cabin, adding more rooms for the children they both wanted. They would continue to trap and fish and live off the land, building a life of quiet happiness far from the chaos of civilization. When morning came, they woke tangled together, stiff from sleeping on the floor, but happier than either had been in years. Lily made breakfast while Emmett brought in wood for the fire, and they ate together, stealing glances and smiles like love-struck youngsters. The snow continued to fall over the next few days, blanketing the valley in white. They were snowed in, but neither minded. They had each other, they had supplies enough to last the winter, and they had the promise of a future together. Emmett continued to fish when the weather allowed, though now Lily was always beside him, and they were careful to protect their hands, wearing gloves and taking breaks to warm up by a fire they built on the creek bank. The pile of salted fish in the cold cellar grew to enormous proportions, far more than 2 people could eat in a winter, but Emmett kept at it, driven by some primal need to provide to ensure that Lily would never know hunger again. And Lily, understanding this need, helped him without complaint, her presence making the work lighter, easier. In early November, when the fishing finally stopped as the creek began to freeze, they took stock of their supplies. The cellar was packed full of smoked and salted fish, dried berries, root vegetables, and the game Emmett had trapped and preserved. They had flour and cornmeal, beans and rice, salt pork and bacon. They had enough to feed 4 people through the winter, let alone 2. You did it, Lily said, surveying their stores with wonder. You made sure I would have enough to eat all winter long. We did it, Emmett corrected, pulling her into his arms. Together. She looked up at him, her eyes bright with tears. My whole life, I have never had anyone care for me the way you do. My father loved me, but in an absent academic way. Thomas married me, but he never truly saw me, never considered my needs above his own wants. But you, Emmett, you worked until your hands cracked and bled, all to make sure I would be safe and fed. How do I ever repay that? You already have, he said, by being here, by choosing to stay, by loving me. That is more than I ever thought I would have. They kissed again, and this time there was no hesitation, no holding back. They made love for the first time that night, slowly and tenderly, learning each other's bodies with patience and care. Emmett was gentle with her, mindful of her smaller frame, worshipful in his touches. Lily was more bold than he expected, her hands exploring the muscles of his chest and arms, her fingers tracing the scars from his past. When they finally came together, it felt inevitable, right? Two pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. Afterwards, they lay wrapped in each other, the fire crackling beside them, and Emmett thought that this was what happiness felt like. Not the wild exhilaration of adventure, or the grim satisfaction of survival, but this quiet contentment, this bone-deep certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The winter passed slowly but sweetly. The snow piled high around the cabin, sometimes reaching halfway up the walls, and there were days when they could not leave at all. But inside, they were warm and well-fed thanks to Emmett's preparation. They cooked fish in a dozen different ways, smoked and salted and fried and baked, and Lily proved to be creative with their limited ingredients, making meals that were genuinely delicious rather than merely sustaining. They spent long hours by the fire, reading and talking and making love. Emmett taught Lily to throw a knife, and she taught him some of the songs her father used to sing. They played cards with a worn deck Emmett had carried with him from the war, and Lily proved to be a ruthless and skilled poker player, much to his amusement. As winter deepened, they began to plan in earnest for their future. Emmett sketched out designs for expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and a larger kitchen, maybe even a small library for the books Lily wanted to collect. They talked about the animals they would raise, chickens for eggs, maybe a cow for milk. They discussed the possibility of planting a garden in the spring, growing their own vegetables to supplement what they foraged and hunted. And they talked about children, the family they both wanted to build. Lily confessed that she'd been married to Thomas for 4 years without conceiving, and she worried that perhaps she was barren. Emmett assured her that it did not matter, that he would love her regardless, but privately he hoped that she would be able to have children. He wanted to see her belly round with his child, wanted to teach his sons and daughters to live in these mountains. Christmas came and went, marked by a simple celebration. Emmett had secretly carved a wooden comb for Lily, smooth and polished, with delicate flowers etched into the handle. She cried when he gave it to her, clutching it to her chest like it was made of gold. She had knitted him a scarf from yarn she had unraveled from an old sweater, the stitches tight and even, in a pattern of cables and twists. He wore it constantly, even inside, because it smelled like her. In January, the worst of the winter storms hit, and they were trapped inside for nearly 3 weeks straight. But their supplies held, the fish and preserved food seeing them through without hardship. Emmett thought often of that day by the creek, of his hands cracking and bleeding as he worked to ensure this moment, this security. It had been worth it, every sting and ache, to see Lily thriving, to know that she would never go hungry again. February brought the first hints of spring, the days growing incrementally longer, the sun a bit stronger. The snow began to recede slowly, and Emmett started checking his trap lines again, venturing out into the crystalline wilderness. Lily always insisted on coming with him, even when the cold made her cheeks burn red and her teeth chatter. She was tougher than she looked, his Lily, stronger than she gave herself credit for. One morning in late February, Lily woke feeling ill, and Emmett fretted over her like a mother hen, certain she had caught some terrible disease. But Lily, after the initial wave of nausea passed, began to smile in a way that made him suspicious. "What is it?" he demanded. "What are you not telling me?" "I think," she said slowly, her hand resting on her still flat belly, "I think I might be pregnant, Emmett." He stared at her, the words not quite making sense at first. Then their meaning crashed over him like a wave, and he let out a whoop of joy that probably scared every animal within a mile. He swept her up in his arms, spinning her around until she laughed and begged him to put her down before she was sick again. "Are you certain?" he asked, setting her down carefully, his hands cradling her face. "Not entirely," she admitted, "but my courses are late, and I have never been late before. And this morning's sickness, it feels different than any illness I have had. I think, Emmett, I really think we are going to have a baby." He kissed her then, pouring all his joy and love and hope into that kiss, and when they broke apart, both of them were crying. A child. They were going to have a child. The thought filled him with a terror and an excitement so profound he could barely breathe. Over the next few weeks, as Lily's pregnancy became more certain, Emmett threw himself into preparing for their journey to town. They would need to leave as soon as the passes cleared enough for travel, both to see a doctor and to find a preacher to marry them. He wanted their child born to married parents, wanted everything to be proper and legal. He also redoubled his efforts on the cabin expansion, working long hours to add the new rooms he had planned. Lily scolded him for overdoing it, but he could not seem to stop. The need to provide, to prepare, to ensure his family would be safe and comfortable was overwhelming. In March, as the snow melted in earnest and the valley began to turn green, they loaded up the wagon Emmett had stored in the lean-to and prepared for the journey to the nearest town with a church. It was a place called Silver Creek, 3 days' travel east, and Emmett had been there only once before, years ago. The journey was slow but uneventful, and Lily bore it well despite her pregnancy. Emmett watched her constantly, alert for any sign of distress, but she seemed to bloom with the changing season, her skin glowing, her spirits high. Silver Creek was bigger than Emmett remembered, grown from a rough mining camp to a proper town with a main street, a general store, a saloon, and most importantly, a church. The preacher, a kind-faced man named Reverend Thomas, agreed to marry them immediately when Emmett explained the situation. The wedding was simple, held in the small wooden church, with only the Reverend and his wife as witnesses. Lily wore the best dress she had brought from Guthrie, and Emmett had cleaned up as best he could, trimming his beard and tying back his hair. When the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Emmett kissed his bride with a fierce tenderness that made the Reverend's wife sigh happily. After the ceremony, they visited the town doctor, an older woman named Dr. Sarah Clark, who had trained in Boston before heading west with her late husband. She examined Lily thoroughly and confirmed what they already knew. Lily was pregnant, about 3 months along, and everything looked healthy and normal. The baby would be born in late September or early October, Dr. Clark estimated, and she gave them a list of things to watch for and instructions for Lily's care. They spent one night in Silver Creek, in the town's small boarding house, and Emmett lay awake for hours, simply watching Lily sleep, his wife now, the mother of his child. He thought about the long, strange journey that had brought them to this moment, from the battlefields of the war to the loneliness of the mountains to that day in Guthrie when he had found her collapsed and desperate. Every choice, every hardship had led him here, and he would not change a single moment of it. The return journey to the valley was even slower, Emmett insisting they take frequent breaks so Lily could rest. But finally, they crested the ridge and looked down at their cabin nestled in the valley below, the creek sparkling in the spring sunshine, and Emmett felt the deep satisfaction of coming home. The spring and summer passed in a blur of activity and preparation. Emmett finished the cabin expansion, creating a nursery for the baby, complete with a cradle he carved from pine and a rocking chair he built with patient care. Lily sewed blankets and tiny clothes, her hands constantly moving, her face glowing with anticipation. They planted the garden they had planned, rows of beans and squash and tomatoes, and Lily tended it faithfully, coaxing life from the mountain soil. Emmett continued to trap and hunt, building up their stores for the next winter, determined that his family would never want for anything. As Lily's belly grew round and full, Emmett found himself consumed with love for her, this strong, capable woman who had walked into his life and transformed it completely. He would often lay with his head resting on her swollen belly, feeling their child move and kick beneath his cheek, marveling at the miracle of it all. In early September, Lily began to get restless, pacing the cabin and rearranging things that did not need rearranging. Emmett recognized the signs from Dr. Clark's instructions and knew the baby would come soon. He made sure everything was ready, the birthing supplies laid out, the water ready to heat, his knife sharpened in case it was needed. The labor began on a cool evening, just as the sun was setting behind the western peaks. Lily's water broke as they were finishing dinner, and Emmett felt his heart leap into his throat. But Lily was calm, her breathing steady as the first contractions began. The labor lasted through the night, long and difficult, and there were moments when Emmett was certain he would lose her, that he would have to trade her life for the child's. But Lily was strong, stronger than he had ever imagined, and when the sun rose on September 15th, 1884, their son entered the world with a lusty cry that echoed through the valley. Emmett caught the baby, his hands trembling, and placed him on Lily's chest, watching as she gathered the tiny, squalling infant close, tears streaming down her face. The baby was perfect, with Emmett's dark hair and Lily's green eyes, his tiny fists waving in indignation at being thrust from his warm, dark world into the bright light of day. "Elijah," Lily whispered, looking down at their son. "Can we call him Elijah? It means, 'The Lord is my God,' and I feel that God brought us together, brought us through everything to this moment." "Elijah," Emmett repeated, the name settling over him like a blessing. "Elijah Stanton. It is perfect." He cleaned up Lily and the baby, his hands gentle and sure despite his exhaustion and overwhelming emotion. When mother and child were both clean and comfortable, swaddled in the blankets Lily had made, Emmett finally allowed himself to collapse into the rocking chair beside the bed, watching his wife and son with eyes that burned from tears and tiredness. "Thank you," he said, his voice hoarse. "Thank you for him. Thank you for you. Thank you for giving me a family." Lily reached out and took his hand, squeezing it tight. "Thank you for saving me," she said, "for gutting and salting all those fish until your hands cracked, for making sure I had enough to eat, for loving me when I was too broken to even love myself. You gave me a life worth living, Emmett. You gave me everything." He leaned down and kissed her forehead, then carefully kissed Elijah's downy head. "We gave each other everything," he said, "and we are just beginning." The first months of Elijah's life were a chaos of sleepless nights and constant feedings, but Emmett and Lily navigated them together, supporting each other through the exhaustion and the uncertainty. Elijah proved to be a healthy, hungry baby who grew like a weed, his legs getting chubby, his cheeks round and pink. As autumn turned to winter, Emmett once again prepared their stores, fishing and hunting and preserving. But this year was different. This year, he was not working out of desperation or fear, but out of love and purpose. He was providing for his family, for his wife and son, and there was a deep satisfaction in that. Lily recovered quickly from the birth, her body healing, her strength returning. She was a natural mother, patient and loving, and Emmett often found himself simply watching her with Elijah, his heart so full it felt like it might burst. They spent that second winter snug and warm in their expanded cabin, the three of them a complete unit. Emmett would hold Elijah while Lily cooked dinner, singing old war songs softly to the baby, who would stare up at him with serious green eyes. Lily would nurse the baby while Emmett read aloud from their books, his voice a comforting rumble in the firelit room. As Elijah grew, he proved to be a bright, curious child, always reaching for new things, always watching the world around him with intense focus. Emmett built him toys from wood, carved animals, and simple puzzles, and Lily sang him songs and told him stories. They were happy, the three of them, happier than Emmett had ever thought possible. The years passed in a sweet, steady rhythm. When Elijah was 2, Lily became pregnant again, and in the spring of 1887, they welcomed a daughter they named Emma, after Lily's mother. Emma was quieter than her brother, more contemplative, with her father's dark eyes and her mother's blonde hair. Emmett was terrified of this tiny girl, afraid he would break her with his big, rough hands, but Lily only laughed and placed the baby in his arms, and Emma looked up at him with such trust that his fears melted away. 2 years after Emma came another son, Samuel, born in 1889. Samuel was a wild child from the start, always moving, always exploring, giving his parents more gray hairs than the previous 2 combined. But he was also fiercely loving, quick to hug and kiss, and Emmett adored him. The cabin continued to expand as the family grew, rooms added as needed, the structure sprawling and comfortable. Emmett taught the children to fish and trap as they got older, passing on the skills that had kept him alive all these years. Lily taught them to read and write, using the books they had collected over the years, determined that her children would have the education she had valued. They made the journey to Silver Creek every few years to visit Dr. Clark and to buy supplies they could not make or trade for. The town continued to grow, and each time they visited, there were more people, more buildings. But Emmett and Lily never felt the pull to move there. Their life was in the mountains, in the valley they had made their own. As Emmett aged, his hair turning gray at the temples, his body bearing the marks of hard living, he would sometimes think back to that day in Guthrie, to the moment he had found Lily collapsed and desperate. He would think about the choice he had made to help her, to bring her here, and he would marvel at how one decision had changed everything. He would remember standing in the cold creek water, his hands cracking and bleeding from the salt and the knife, cleaning fish until his vision blurred, driven by the desperate need to make sure she would have enough to eat. And he would look at his family, at his wife and children, healthy and happy and thriving, and know that every moment of pain had been worth it. Lily, for her part, never forgot those early days either. She remembered being so hungry she could barely stand, remembered the terror of being alone and indebted in a hostile world, and she remembered Emmett appearing like an answer to a prayer she had not even known she was praying, this huge, quiet man who had looked at her with such kindness and respect. She remembered the piles of fish he had prepared, the cracked and bleeding hands he had hidden from her until she found out. She remembered the fierce determination in his eyes when he told her he wanted to make sure she had enough to eat. No one had ever cared for her like that, with such selfless devotion, and she had fallen in love with him in that moment, though it had taken her weeks to admit it to herself. Now, surrounded by the life they had built together, the children they had raised, the home they had created, she would sometimes take his hands in hers, running her fingers over the faint scars that still marked his palms. And she would kiss those hands, grateful beyond words for what they had done, for what they represented. Love, sacrifice, provision, protection, everything a woman could ever want from the man she loved. On their 10th wedding anniversary, in the spring of 1894, Emmett took Lily down to the creek where he had gutted and salted all those fish. The children were playing in the cabin, watched over by a neighbor woman who had moved into the valley a few years before, and Emmett and Lily had a rare moment alone together. They sat on the bank where he had worked all those years ago, the water singing over the stones, the sun warm on their faces. Emmett held her hand, studying her face, seeing the girl he had found in Guthrie and the woman she had become, strong and confident and beautiful. "Do you remember what I told you that day in the cabin?" he asked, "when you were tending my hands?" "You told me a lot of things that day," she said with a smile. "Which part do you mean?" "I told you that the thought of you going hungry again made me feel like I could not breathe. I told you that in 3 weeks you had made the cabin feel like home. I told you that something in me recognized something in you." "I remember," she said softly. "I remember every word." "It is still true," he said, "all of it. After 10 years, 3 children, countless winters and summers, and everything in between, it is all still true. You are still the one who makes this place home. I still cannot bear the thought of you wanting for anything. And I still feel like I was made to find you, like everything in my life led me to that day in Guthrie so I could bring you here." Lily's eyes filled with tears, and she leaned against him, her head on his broad shoulder. "I love you," she said. "I will love you until the day I die and beyond. You saved me, Emmett. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. You worked until your hands cracked and bled to make sure I would have enough to eat, and you have never stopped providing for me, protecting me, loving me. I am the luckiest woman alive." "I am the lucky one," he corrected, tilting her face up to kiss her. "I got you." They sat there for a long time, wrapped in each other, listening to the creek and the birds and the wind in the trees. And Emmett thought about the fish he had cleaned on this bank, about the salt and blood and pain. He thought about how sometimes love required sacrifice, how sometimes providing for someone meant pushing yourself beyond what you thought you could endure. And he thought about how it was always, always worth it. Years continued to pass, and the children grew into young adults. Elijah became a trapper like his father, strong and capable, with a wife of his own and plans to build a cabin on the other side of the valley. Emma married a doctor who came through Silver Creek, and though it broke Emmett's heart a little to see her leave, he was glad she had found happiness. Samuel stayed close to home, helping his father with the trap lines in the cabin, showing no signs of wanting to wander. And through it all, Emmett and Lily remained the center, the foundation upon which their family was built. They grew old together, their bodies showing the marks of hard living and harder winters, but their love never dimmed. If anything, it grew stronger, deeper, tempered by years of partnership and devotion. When Emmett's hands began to ache from arthritis, especially in the cold months, Lily would massage them with the same salve she had made all those years ago, her touch gentle and sure. And he would remember those days by the creek, gutting fish until his hands cracked, and he would smile, knowing he would do it all again in a heartbeat. They became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, their family spreading through the valley and beyond. And every winter, when the snow piled high and the family gathered in the big cabin for celebrations, someone would inevitably ask Emmett and Lily to tell the story of how they met. And Emmett would pull Lily close, his arm around her shoulders, and he would tell them about the day he found her in Guthrie, about the decision to bring her north, about the fish he had prepared to make sure she would have enough to eat. He would show them his hands, the faint scars still visible after all these years, and he would tell them that love sometimes meant sacrifice, that providing for someone you cared about was the highest calling a person could have. And Lily would add her part, about being saved, about finding hope when she thought there was none left, about learning what real love looked like through the actions of a quiet mountain man who worked until his hands bled. She would talk about the winter they had survived together, the love they had built, the family they had created, and the children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren would listen, rapt, understanding that they were hearing something important, something foundational. They were hearing the story of their family, of how it all began with fish and salt and cracked hands and desperate love. Emmett Stanton died in the winter of 1918, at the age of 63, surrounded by his family in the cabin he had built with his own hands. Lily held him as he slipped away, whispering words of love and gratitude, promising to see him again someday. He died peacefully, a smile on his weathered face, content in the knowledge that he had lived a good life, that he had provided well for those he loved. Lily followed him 18 months later, in the summer of 1920, at the age of 59. Her children found her sitting in the rocking chair Emmett had built, looking out the window at the valley she had loved, a peaceful expression on her face. In her hands was the wooden comb Emmett had carved for her that first Christmas, worn smooth from decades of use. They were buried side by side on a hill overlooking the creek, in a spot Emmett had chosen years before. Their graves were marked with simple wooden crosses, and in time, those crosses weathered and faded, but the family never forgot where they were. Every year, on the anniversary of their wedding, the family would gather there, telling stories and remembering the love that had started it all. And sometimes, on quiet winter evenings when the snow lay thick on the ground and the wind howled through the mountains, the family would swear they could feel them there, Emmett and Lily, watching over the valley they had loved, over the family they had created. And they would remember the fish and the cracked hands, the desperation and the devotion, the simple truth that love was about action as much as emotion, about providing and protecting and sacrificing for those you held dear. The cabin still stood, expanded and modified over the generations, but fundamentally the same structure Emmett had built with his own hands. The creek still sang over its stones, and the fish still ran thick in the spring and fall. And the family that had started with a desperate widow and a lonely mountain man continued to thrive, living by the principles their ancestors had embodied: hard work, devotion, sacrifice, and above all, love. The story of Emmett and Lily became legend in the valley and beyond, passed down through generations as an example of what real love looked like. It was not grand gestures or dramatic proclamations, though those had their place. It was gutting fish until your hands cracked and bled, working past pain and exhaustion to make sure the person you loved had enough to eat. It was building a home and a life together, brick by brick, day by day. It was choosing each other, over and over again, through hardship and joy, through poverty and plenty, through youth and age. Their great-great-grandchildren living in a world Emmett and Lily could never have imagined, with automobiles and electric lights and stores full of food, would still tell the story. They would talk about the mountain man who saved the widow woman, who brought her north to his cabin, who fished until his hands were ruined to make sure she had enough to eat through the winter. They would talk about the love that grew from that sacrifice, strong enough to weather any storm, deep enough to last multiple lifetimes. And when those descendants faced their own hardships, their own moments of desperation or doubt, they would remember Emmett standing in that cold creek water, knife in hand, blood running down his arms, salt burning in his wounds. They would remember that love was not just a feeling, but a choice, an action, a commitment. They would remember that sometimes you had to work until your hands cracked, had to push yourself beyond what seemed possible, all for the sake of someone you loved. And they would understand that this was not weakness, but strength, not burden, but privilege. To have someone worth sacrificing for, someone who made the pain worthwhile, someone who turned a lonely cabin in the mountains into a home filled with warmth and laughter and love that was the greatest gift life could offer. The story of the mountain man who gutted and salted fish until his hands cracked, ensuring his love had enough to eat all winter long, became more than just a family tale. It became a touchstone, a reminder of what really mattered in life, not wealth or status or ease, but connection, devotion, the willingness to bleed for those you loved. And somewhere, in whatever place the spirits of good people go when they leave this earth, Emmett and Lily Stanton watched over their descendants and smiled. They had built something lasting, something real, something that would echo through time. From fish and salt and cracked hands, from hunger and desperation and hope, they had created a legacy of love that would never die. The valley remained much as they had known it, wild and beautiful, harsh and unforgiving, but also full of life and possibility. The mountains stood eternal, their peaks crowned with snow, their slopes thick with pine and aspen. The creek ran clear and cold, singing its endless song. And in the cabin on the hill, generations of Stantons continued to live and love and thrive, carrying forward the lessons their ancestors had taught them. That love was sacrifice, that providing for your family was sacred, that sometimes the greatest acts of devotion happen not in grand moments, but in quiet, painful work, done without complaint or expectation of reward. That cracked hands and aching muscles were small prices to pay for the privilege of caring for someone who meant everything. And so, the story continued, passed from parent to child, from grandparent to grandchild, an unbroken chain stretching across decades and then centuries. The story of how it all began, with a mountain man and a widow woman, fish and salt, cracked hands, and desperate love. The story of Emmett and Lily Stanton, whose love had built an empire not of wealth or power, but of family and devotion, of sacrifice and service, of two people who had found each other against all odds and had chosen to build a life together, no matter the cost. In the end, that was what mattered. Not how much money you had, or what you accomplished in the eyes of the world, but whether you loved well, whether you provided for those who depended on you, whether you were willing to stand in cold water and gut fish until your hands bled, all to make sure someone you loved had enough to eat. Emmett had done that, and more. He had given Lily not just food for her body, but sustenance for her soul. He had given her safety when she was vulnerable, hope when she was despairing, love when she was alone. He had given her a family, a home, a life worth living. And Lily had given him just as much. She'd given him purpose when he was drifting, companionship when he was lonely, joy when he had forgotten what it felt like. She had given him children to carry on his name, a reason to work and plan and dream. She had made his cabin a home and his life complete. Together, they had proven that love was not just a word or a feeling, but a force capable of transforming lives, of creating something beautiful from nothing, of turning hardship into triumph. They had shown that with determination and devotion, two people could build a life of happiness and meaning, even in the harshest circumstances. And their story, the story of the mountain man who gutted and salted fish until his hands cracked, so she would have enough to eat all winter long, lived on. It lived in the memories of their descendants, in the walls of the cabin they had built, in the valley they had loved. It lived in every act of selfless devotion, every sacrifice made for love, every person who chose to work past pain to provide for someone they cherished. It was a story of the Wild West, of that brief, brutal, beautiful period when people carved lives from wilderness, when survival was never guaranteed, when strength and determination were required just to make it through another day. But more than that, it was a timeless story, a universal story. A story about what it means to love someone wholly and completely, with every fiber of your being. Emmett and Lily's love had started with fish and salt and cracked hands. It had grown through shared hardship and quiet moments, through children and grandchildren and the steady accumulation of days turned into years. It had lasted through youth and age, through poverty and modest prosperity, through every challenge life threw at them. And when death finally parted them, it was only their bodies that separated. Their love continued, woven into the fabric of the family they had created, living on in every generation that followed. That was their legacy. Not wealth or fame or any material thing, but love. Pure, devoted, sacrificial love that had started with a desperate act of provision and had bloomed into something that would never die. And as long as there were people who remembered their story, who told it to their children and grandchildren, that love would continue to inspire, to challenge, to remind people of what really mattered in this brief, precious life. The mountain man and the widow woman, the fish and the salt, the cracked hands and the winter survived together. It was a simple story, really, but it contained everything important, everything true, everything that made life worth living, and it was a story that would never end.